Warm virtual welcome to everyone. Hello, my name is Sudha David-Wilp. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to this week's coronavirus update. This time we have a panel from the United States. Today we're especially grateful to have two respected health experts with us, Dr. Peter Bach and Gardiner Harris, to discuss the new normal and what we can expect moving forward. Dr. Peter Bach is the director of Memorial Sloan Kettering Center for Health Policy and Outcomes. He is a physician, epidemiologist, researcher, and healthcare policy expert whose work focuses on the cost and value of anti-cancer drugs. Dr. Bach has been inducted into the National Academy of Medicine, the American Society of Clinical Investigators, and the Johns Hopkins University Society of Scholars. Gardiner Harris is my colleague. He's a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Until 2019, he covered international diplomacy for the New York Times. Previously, he served as White House South Asia public health and pharmaceutical reporter for the New York Times. His stories, both in South Asia and the United States, resulted in concrete policy changes. For example, his public health stories led to the withdrawal of dozens of childhood cough and cold medicines and led to federal legislation mandating the disclosure of payments by drug makers to doctors. Thank you both of you for joining us. I'm waiting for them to appear on the screen and then we can get started with my questions. There we go. Ta-da! Dr. Bach, we'll start with you. You're here, you're with us zooming in from New York. What's it like out there right now, the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States? How's the city faring at this moment in time?
New York's reached an odd sort of, almost sort of pseudo-apocalyptic equilibrium where the vast majority of the city is shut down. My friends and I often talk about the fact that, we can walk down the middle of Fifth Avenue, but not in the way that people used to talk about what they could accomplish on that street, but instead because it's entirely abandoned. And we are actively thinking, at my hospital about how we try and go back to work. We have, of course, had our frontline healthcare workers going to work every single day, no problem, but we're doing it bootstrapped across, Ubers and parking coupons that we're paying for. And our ridership, even on mass transit's down about 90 to 95%, making the subways and even the commuter trains somewhat safe because no one is on them. But it's very hard to figure out how we go from here to any semblance of normalcy, or even the kind of the concept of urban living at our density, how we get back to it. The number of people who've had the infection in the city is probably about 1 in 5. So even though we're at the leading edge, we're nowhere close to kind of having a protected population.
Tell us a little bit about what you've been hearing from your colleagues and what you've seen yourself about how this disease has evolved. We keep learning new things about COVID-19, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the pathogen. And in your opinion, was this made in a lab somewhere in China? Tell us a little bit about what you think.
Yeah, so on your last question, I have nothing additional to add. I have no particular insights about where this virus was made. It seems unlikely and sort of conspiratorial to think such things, but I have no sort of firsthand way of answering that kind of question. I think there is, there's sort of good news in the sense that just through sheer exposure to patients with this condition, we as a medical profession are learning our way through it like we have always done, through trial and error and sharing insights. And so over the last 2 months, for sure, kind of the constellation of symptoms and signs that characterize a disease, what the best kind of way to triage patients is, how to handle things like the best way to oxygenate or make sure people have oxygen on their blood, from everything from positioning to how we use our ventilators, even these issues that you've probably seen in the lay press about blood clots and the role they play, I think have all, been sort of slowly approached, as well as some of this kind of crude experimentation that's been going on with various therapies and trying to get insights about them. So, in sum, I think a patient has a modestly better chance of doing well today than they did 2 months ago, just through that experience. But it is every week is a, wow, now we've seen somebody with this kind of constellation associated with the virus. And, one of the risks always in situations like this is you can see people with underlying conditions who are also infected. And because, we don't have good studies with good alternative comparative populations, we start concluding, oh, the virus is causing this problem that even prior to the virus, we would still see.
So I was telling my colleagues, I consulted a lot of the physicians in my family to write down some notes. And you brought up the question, the point about not having a lot of experience with this disease. But I mean, from the serology tests that you've seen, I mean, is there any data on the immunity and the antibodies? Are they strong? Are they weak? Do you think there will be some reinfection? If you've already had COVID-19, could you get it again?
Yeah, I don't have anything particular to add to what's, I don't have primary knowledge of this. I can tell you that at least in the US, we are nowhere close to taking advantage of the cohorts, the groups of people we have already who are antibody positive. We are trying to do that at my institution. I know a bunch of other people are as well. But that basic question about the protective duration, about why some people get antibodies quickly, others they seem to be delayed. What's the titer, the level of antibodies that confers protection? We don't have answers to any of those things. We have multiple examples, of course, of viruses that once you get antibody levels, you are protected. It is the driving kind of strategy in vaccination for things like hepatitis B. And we actually figure out if you are properly vaccinated by checking your antibody levels for hepatitis B. But there's lots and lots of examples, and we've all experienced it, where you can have a viral infection, develop antibodies, then develop another viral infection in the same family. So we have to figure all those things out. And it's, as somebody who's, if you will, scientifically oriented, it's a deep frustration of mine that we aren't taking, I'm not asking for maximal use of available information about people. I just would like some strategy where we ask those sorts of questions. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are antibody positive. Nobody is following them to see if they get reinfected.
And you talked about perhaps having, figuring out how to deal with the patients when they contract the virus, and perhaps there's some therapies on the horizon. But what about the ultimate question about the vaccination? I mean, do you think it's possible to have a vaccine and distribute it by the beginning of the next year? And are you concerned that perhaps certain protocols are being ignored in the race to have a vaccine?
There's a lot of reasons. If you sort of think about everything that has to go right for us to have a vaccine by, call it, winter, spring of 21, it gets pretty hard to get there. It's sort of like, I'm trying to avoid gambling metaphors, but drawing multiple inside straights in a row. It is really exciting that so many people have dove into this, but we've never done this before, turn around and create a vaccine this quickly and test it adequately. And part of the math is just, you can't work around it, such as you would theoretically with like long-term studies of people who've gotten the vaccine to see effectiveness, ability to revaccinate, and toxicity, side effects, adverse events, and things like that. And if you need, say, a year of follow-up, you can't make that year shorter. You can only skip it. But even prior to that, this isn't new, trying to create vaccines for very, very dangerous diseases like HIV. And every year we get smarter, but every year we keep finding out biology is still a lot smarter than we are. So I actually think, at least in the US, I think we go off a cliff when let's just wave a wand and have a vaccine with limited long-term toxicity follow-up data, but reasonable effectiveness. I have this underlying concern that in the US we will have widespread resistance to taking the vaccine, particularly from people who are, in my view, set aside the public health implications in our sort of rugged individualistic approach, we'll be making rational decisions to not be vaccinated. If they're young and otherwise healthy, their chance of getting infected is pretty low. If they do get infected, their chance of being seriously ill is pretty low. On top of that, if they get seriously ill, their chance of dying is very, very low on top of that. And every time there's another news conference about a new treatment, remdesivir, whatever, antibodies, that further drive down the risk of, being seriously ill or dying if you get the infection, it goes in the column of, hey, maybe I shouldn't be vaccinated. Again, this isn't I'm not talking about some sort of conspiracy anti-vax stance, fully rational decision. And so we may have a really challenging road ahead, even amongst the kind of rational decision makers, because at least in the US, I don't think there's widespread view that there's a social contract to expose yourself to a minimal amount of risk to protect others. We're seeing protests over people wearing masks, for God's sake.
I mean, given all that, explaining all the challenges just in terms of developing and distributing a vaccine and the, people being averse to taking one, is a second wave inevitable then?
Absent some feature of the virus that we don't understand, such as, a lot of us have been exposed and many of us are just not natural hosts and we have no evidence of that. Absent this sort of theory that it's been here much longer than we thought it has, I don't see any reason that the things change that much. It may have attacked the demographic groups more where the risks are greater than the population as a whole, such as people in long-term care facilities and older people. But so those might mitigate against future waves if there's immunity, but it's very hard to wrap your head around anything, people being able to gather again. Okay,
well, thanks so much for those medical perspectives. I'm going to switch over to Gardiner now. And just to remind our listeners, please send me your questions with the Q&A chat, and I will get to them as quickly as possible. But I wanted to talk to Gardiner actually about the title of this, or the description in the invitation that we sent out. So what is the new normal right now in the United States? We have over 80,000 dead in the country from this disease. Dr. Bach talked about people resisting sort of the public health guidelines. What's the new normal like?
I think what's important about what Peter was talking about, and Peter and I have been talking about this stuff for weeks and weeks, which is that both of us think that there is just a proliferation of magical thinking in the United States, particularly in this administration. I was a White House correspondent. I know these guys fairly well. And there needs to be a sort of a basic understanding of what the most likely scenario is going to be for the next year and a half. And the most likely scenario, barring, as Peter said, a series of inside straights, is that at least 500,000 people will die. This virus will, tear through the population. At least half of us to 70% of us will get it. We will not have a vaccine in the next year. That's again, we might, but that's the most likely scenario. I mean, I covered the pharmaceutical industry for, 15 years. Johnson & Johnson is one of the companies that has gotten $1 billion from the United States government to develop a vaccine. Johnson & Johnson has never developed a vaccine before. Johnson & Johnson's labs, 95% of Johnson & Johnson's drug revenue come from drugs that were developed outside of Johnson & Johnson. So its labs are sort of uniquely barren. So, there are lots of hopeful announcements being made, but they're being made by a lot of people who have actually never done this before. Again, something might happen, but I see the chance of a vaccine coming in, by the end of the year is around 10, 15%. And as Peter said, and we've talked about this a lot, the arrival of a vaccine is not an endpoint. It is a beginning of the end. And that beginning will likely take a considerable period of time. First of all, there are likely to be manufacturing challenges. Again, I can give any number of examples of of manufacturing limitations for particularly biologics, which is what this is likely to be. And then you're going to have a whole series. I mean, the United States, obviously, as our European friends know, suffer a series of, fairly important cultural pathologies. And one of them is this kind of, independent streak that Peter sort of nicely talked about, that of course leads us to have 30,000 deaths a year from gunshot wounds. And unfortunately, those sort of folks who are into guns, and I lived for much of my life in Kentucky, know lots of them, have somehow taken it in their head that they need to make decisions independent of people like my friend Tony Fauci. Will they take this vaccine? I'm not at all sure they will. And I think that they're actually going to have some fairly logical reasons not to, beyond the anti-vaxxers who I've written about for 20 years.
So, I mean, you just described that the United States and maybe other countries in this world, I'm sitting here in Germany actually, and there is a much different fatality rate here in this country than in the United States. Granted, the country is much smaller, but what does this do to our image, the United States image? I mean, in the sense that, because right now we're sort of in these national state of mind, but for a pandemic, you have to have a global response. Is it too late for the United States to take on that role?
I think it is too late. Just in the comparison between the United States and Germany, let's remember, the United States has allowed for 30 years the United States to have an HIV/AIDS death rate that is 5 times higher than Germany's. Why do we do this? Because we've decided we're not really into contact tracing. We don't have a robust public health system. We allow people who are infected to continue to infect others because of some idea about freedom and other things. Also, of course, Republicans have, it's sort of their happy place to cut the CDC and public health departments. They immediately, when they took over the House in 2010, set about cutting this CDC, even though the H1N1 virus had just wiped out many of the stockpiles in the National Strategic Stockpile for PPE, which we are now, of course, in dire need for. Republicans decided not to replace it because that's what they like to do. So I think that we have an enormous number of challenges, and we're going to see, of course, how this plays out politically in the United States. It's a really interesting political dynamic for Trump in particular. Of course, the people most at risk are the elderly. They are the most reliable Republican voters. But the biggest talkers in the Republican platform are sort of the Tea Party people who are really pushing for a reopening fast. Those two groups are really at odds with each other, and there's some real indication that the elderly are far more skeptical about Trump's push to reopen the economy. So it could set up a really difficult dynamic for him going forward in this election in 2020. And
so we're starting to accumulate questions, but I have one more question before I'm going to have Dr. Bach turn on his mute button or unmute himself as well. But so what does this mean? And this is probably a session in itself, but what does this mean for the US healthcare system? I mean, is this going to give us pause to say that we need to do something? Because obviously pricing for drugs, people are afraid to get tests, people are not insured, and that doesn't help when there's a pandemic. What do you think long-term or even in the short term this means for that US healthcare system?
Look, I'm hoping that it leads to sort of a fundamental reanalysis. The United States healthcare system is really good at which is that we have, very high level care at places like Peter's Hospital, where you can get, the best care absolutely in the world, but we're miserable at us, which is the sort of the public health things that actually lead to a huge amount of death and suffering, right? I mean, the United States has an enormous amount of preventable deaths from things like diabetes, the kinds of things that really affect the sort of the lower half of the income spectrum. And I think a pandemic is one of those things that really reveals these sort of cracks enormous cracks in the healthcare system. I mean, it is, Sudha, it is appalling that to this date, there are 14 states in the United States that refuse to expand their Medicaid programs under Obamacare. You know, it's an enormous amount of money into their state, so it would be economically beneficial. It would, of course, benefit the health of their population enormously. And these states have simply decided, for political reasons that are, for me, almost impossible to fathom, not to take the money from the federal government to make the health of their own citizens better. So there is this instinct in the United States that's almost predatory, and this will reveal itself in this pandemic.
So Dr. Bach, there's two medical questions that are directed to you. One from Belgrade regarding the symptoms of COVID-19. You know, we talked about how the disease has evolved, and we've seen news about, you know, COVID toes, et cetera. How come these symptoms weren't apparent in Wuhan at the beginning of the year? We didn't really hear about those sorts of symptoms. Has it mutated, or why do you think there's a difference?
So I haven't, I think part of it is just so Gardiner's talked a little bit about this potentially being a transformational moment. And that's in one place where I think I have confidence is in this narrow corner of medical publishing. I'm more skeptical, I think, probably than Gardiner, that this will lead to any broader social insight that will say, oh, hey, maybe people shouldn't have health insurance through their employer if 20, 30 million people could suddenly lose their jobs. But on the medical side, by coincidence, we've gone through about 10 years of trying to adopt things that are widely used in the social sciences, which is the use of preprints. So people can do research papers. I write research papers myself and just post them to servers for the public, clearly labeled as pre-publication or, you know, pre-printed. And because of that, most of the things we're seeing regarding symptom constellations and things like that are from major medical centers, and they are pre-printed. And if we waited for the medical journals, which have their own kind of processes, we'd probably be waiting several months in many cases for this kinds of insights, because they, you know, as is often the case, you send it to one journal. I've experienced this many, many times in my life, and they read it and they're like, this is terrible, send it somewhere else. And you kind of go down the food chain. It can take months, it can take more than a year. And even with the pressing interest here, there would be delays. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think another is that, you know, it's just a scale thing. You know, Wuhan was, compared to the US as a whole, even compared, you know, Wuhan sort of slightly, approximately the scale of New York City. So I think the broader country has much more experience. We've seen stuff coming out of California, Washington, other places like that. But I think it's mostly this pre-printing. Go ahead.
And then just a clarification question. Somebody has asked, like, you had mentioned there could be a logical reason for people not to take a vaccine. Was that because of, did you say that because you thought that everything's being rushed, or at the beginning?
Well, first of all, I want to be completely clear that I am not trying to embrace any sort of conspiratorial hypothesis regarding vaccines or the creation of the illness. But there is, if you will, a bifurcation, and it cuts along the axis that Gardiner was just using of me versus us. And in the context of a vaccine, it's a considerably different decision, like wearing masks really, but I still am kind of shocked that people have decided masks are today's Maginot Line. The idea of vaccinating for the vast majority of people is about not becoming vectors, people who carry the disease from place to place. And that is very much a decision to vaccinate then, which is a decision about us, not me. While a young, healthy person could look at the statistics, and I don't know exactly what they are, but I think it's probably 1 in 10,000 kind of risk that a young, healthy person, if they get infected, will actually have all these things happen that lead to their death. So they could reasonably look at it and say, well, the adverse event risk is not well characterized below the 1 in 10,000 rate. And if everybody else vaccinates, we have this free rider problem. If, everyone else in the world vaccinates except me, I'm great. And so I meant it in the technical sense of rational. The individual calculus could come out easily as, I'm on the margin equally well off or better off not vaccinating, and I don't really like needles anyway. And I'm going to just wait for everyone else to do it first. And I think that ties directly to Gardiner's point. If anything, we've seen in this country, either we're seeing it more clearly or it is emerging more dramatically, this decision to have battle fronts on these kind of philosophical lines between the us versus me as individual. And I see every reason to believe this will be a version of that. No matter how the election comes out, it will be largely also along those political ideologies. And if Biden is the next president, it will become this sort of anti-democrat kind of stance. We're seeing, there was a recent hearing in the Senate. It was only Republicans not wearing masks. The Democrats were wearing masks, is my understanding. And it will become this issue. It will be a stance beyond, as I mentioned, just this basic rational, truly rational decision that I, as an individual, I'm probably not going to be better off having this vaccine. I don't actually know.
And Sudha, Peter,
Sorry.
But I just wanted to point out, in the calculus for vaccinating your children goes down that road even farther. We know that children are, highly unlikely to get a bad outcome with this. If you're at all suspicious about the process of this vaccine, are you going to vaccinate your children, particularly in the early months? I think that there would be a very rational decision to sort of say, well, let's see how this kind of plays out. And we also know that children, particularly school-age children, are sort of humanities super spreaders. There's a classic example of the Japanese who required vaccinations for the flu in children, then stopped that requirement, and that led to a vast increase in deaths among the elderly. So it's not, it plays into, as Peter said, and as we've spoken about a ton, a lot of the political fault lines, but it's not crazy to make these decisions to delay vaccinating yourself and particularly your children.
Sure. I think the way you both describe it, I can see why any would weigh the risks. That makes total sense, and not necessarily being a conspiracy theorist when you make that sort of decision. But it's interesting that Peter made a good segue, because two questions are sort of related. Anne and Jack are asking, both of you are describing sort of structural fault lines in the US, and maybe an election won't make a difference. But two of the questions are related to that. One, Anne has asked, is there an opportunity for the US to reinvent itself with this pandemic? And Jack is asking, Gardiner specifically to you, I'll give these two questions to you. If Biden does win in November, if you were an advisor, what would you advise the new administration?
So one of Peter's and my favorite word nowadays is kakistocracy, which is an English word for government by the incompetent. And it sort of perfectly, I think, summarizes, our present moment. I didn't want to give the impression that I thought that the United States is capable of truly recasting itself. I think that, obviously change generally happens on a very incremental basis. There is a movement within the Democratic Party, certainly, to expand healthcare under Medicare for all. I think increasingly, Peter and I both believe that, Obamacare was really about expanding insurance. And I think I'm hoping that the next administration really looks at expanding care, which is different than insurance. And there are ways to do the latter. And I think obviously one of the things that the Democrats are really looking at is drug pricing, which Peter is actually one of the world's experts on. So I expect if Biden wins, Peter will become a very prominent consultant to this next administration. There are basic other ideas basically about delivering care and about perhaps, as Peter talked about, taking the edges off of this system of employer-based healthcare that really, I think this moment demonstrates is deeply problematic through the courses of the economics ups and downs. Does that answer either one of those questions?
I mean, it gives us a little hope rather than we've been sort of dark.
I think it's Churchill who said the U.S. eventually arrives at the right solution, but only after exhausting all the alternatives. And I think that thesis is now being tested because we seem to continue to pursue alternatives that make little sense. And to emphasize or to reinforce what Gardiner just said, of course, the Affordable Care Act was about the expansion of insurance. It was actually rebranded halfway through its development with the insertion of insurance into its kind of marketing material, if you will, in the political sphere. But it's not just that we have to worry about the delivery system here. This pandemic is exposing what we've known for some period of time, which is that an emphasis on providing insurance doesn't actually provide great inroads into public health. And so for several years in a row, we've had declines in life expectancy in the US with expanding insurance. And I'm not saying those two things are causal. It's almost as if they have two different forces underlying them. And all this exposes here is, we are unprepared for pandemics. We're unprepared for thinking about anything from a population level. The opiate crisis has ripped through this country vastly more than many other high-income countries because, we've just kind of said, let's try and let the market work itself out. And, that has borne this rotten fruit that we are now having to deal with when we most need a kind of collective effort.
There's just about 10 minutes left. If there are more questions, send them my way to the Q&A function, but I think I'm going to dip into the repository of Dr. David questions from the family and ask a question about, one of my cousins said, ask Dr. Bach about an influenza epidemic. Apparently, we've been waiting for a lethal influenza epidemic. Could both occur at the same time this fall? And he also asked, what have we learned from the pandemic? I mean, you seem to think that we haven't learned anything, but is there something that we have learned thus far and how we can better prepare ourselves for the next pandemic?
All right, so influenza, as I think the questioner no doubt knows, is a disease that attacks us with different mutant forms essentially every year, and we play a guessing game to prepare for it, partially because what Gardiner was raising, the long production time for vaccines for it. And the intensity of them really does naturally vary anyway, and it is, I think everyone believes that we could see kind of 100-year type events with another influenza outbreak. It's difficult to look back to 1918 because there was a lot of other things that were going on there, obviously, after the war, great degree of malnutrition, overcrowding, very different from here, even today in cities. But, I think we should prepare for these 100-year floods and not just have them arrive and say, wow, where did all this water come from? What concerns me, and this gets back to the same theme both Gardiner and I have hit on during this conversation, is that this pandemic should teach us lessons, but actually there's no new lessons to be learned. There's insights we have had for a very long time that we have walked away from or ignored because of other priorities, be it rugged individualism or whatever, or the marketplace. And so I'm concerned that, we've now seen rates of mortality in the US that vastly outstrip on a per month basis any of the diseases we've invested decades in, billions of dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars to try and tackle. And we will take little from it and make the mistake of saying, oh, well, that good thing, that's over. hope that won't happen again. And, all the books and all the briefings and all the planning that went around this will, go back into that place where they have, the ark that Indiana Jones discovered and, or found and like stored away.
Sudha,
Well,
let
actually,
me,
yeah,
let
can
me-
I just
let me just-
maybe on that question, Gardiner? I mean, but then if not the US government, what about institutions like the WHO? Have they perhaps learned anything from this pandemic? Are there other bodies out there that can have the playbook for pandemics and pull it out if this were to happen again?
So 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, Dick Cheney brought into his office two friends of mine, Tara O'Toole and Randy Larson, who were at the time probably the two foremost pandemic experts in the United States. Randy brought in a briefcase, the security at the White House, which I of course know quite well, been there many, many times, was as high as it ever was. His briefcase was inspected multiple times by Secret Service. He then came in, talked to Dick Cheney about an exercise that had just occurred 2 months before, a pandemic bioterrorism exercise. And Dick Cheney asked, well, what would a bioterror weapon look like? And Randy reached into this briefcase that had been inspected multiple times and pulled out a test tube and said, well, it would look just like this, Mr. Vice President. And of course, had he opened it up and had it had a bioterror weapon in it, almost everybody in the White House would have been killed. Dick Cheney was deeply, deeply impressed. And publicly, they spent somewhere in the order of $50 billion trying to create a vaccine manufacturing capacity in the United States. The rumors are that in the Black budgets that they had access to, they spent another 10 times as much. All of that vaccine infrastructure, they had multiple companies, basically was abandoned and sold for pennies 8 or 9 years later, and we have none of it. Are we going to learn these lessons, Sudha? I mean, the other interesting thing about this moment is that we are really the first generation that really has not lived with the terror of, our parents didn't have to have the terror of these summertime polio outbreaks where they had to, bring the children inside all summer long. We're the first that didn't really have to live with the worry about measles or going sterile when, we get the mumps as adults or any number of other things. So there is sort of almost a viral confidence in this generation. Even AIDS, you could sort of, if you were heterosexual, you could kind of decide, well, that's not going to be for me. So, are we now going to be in a different place mentally? I'm a little skeptical. Okay,
well, we're coming to a close, but I'm going to try and get in 4 questions and I'm going to cluster them. Alexander had a question for Gardiner about you mentioning that you envision that 60 to 70% of the US population will probably contract the disease. Do you think this will also be applicable to other countries? So hold that thought before you get to it. And then Peter, there is a question about a vaccine maybe far away, but are there antiviral drugs that are in the pipeline that we can be hopeful for? And then I'm going to close it out with one question for both of you. Again, another question from a family member. He mentioned that there is a scientist named Maurice Hillman that talked about pandemics occurring every 68 years. But now that we have globalization and, humankind is encroaching on animal habitats, et cetera, will we see this pandemic life cycle shortening? And that would be a tragedy if we're not learning anything, because they're going to probably occur at shorter intervals.
So just on the last question, Tara O'Toole believes that we are in the era of pandemics. And if you just look at the AIDS pandemic, for instance, it appeared in the 1920s in Africa at first, and it took basically 60 years to really, or 50 years. It was in the United States, probably in the 1970s. And then, obviously it wasn't until the MMWR publication in the United States in 1981 that it was finally identified. Because of global travel and everything, the acceleration of the appearance in pandemics, and of course us going into all of these parts of these various viral reservoirs that we humans had never sort of gotten into, Tara believes that we are now going to be seeing these regularly. What was the question that was actually addressed at me? I'm sorry, Sudha. It was
about 60 to 70% of the US population.
I just see that's the most likely scenario. That's where we are in terms of the infection rate of this thing. I mean, if you talk to Mike Osterholm,
but do you think that's applicable to other countries? I mean, I think it's hard for you to imagine, but
there's no reason to, humans are humans, and we're all experiencing quarantine fatigue. We can't stay inside forever. We aren't going to stay inside forever. The kids are going to go to school. The kids are going to spread this around amongst all of us. I think all of these measures are helpful because it gets us to places, as Peter talks about, of we now know how to handle infections a little bit better. The death rates will go down slightly as these therapeutics, which are never going to be very good because viral therapeutics never are, but we may be able to get things a little bit on the margins. But I see no reason to. In other words, the most likely scenario is that the globe gets to 70%.
Okay. All right. Peter, my question about the 68-year life cycle, will that shorten? And also, do you agree with Gardiner that the antiviral therapeutics, they may be in the pipeline, but it's not going to have a huge effect?
Yeah, I don't know about the cycle length. I think the crowding, the size of the population, the amount of mobility, assuming we all go back to air travel, which is sort of inconceivable that we don't, but maybe. But as long as we stay global, you've got to figure that that rate will accelerate. And hopefully will be better when we see early warning signs the next time. So on the therapeutic side, I think it's nice to end this with somewhat of an optimistic note. Let me point out a couple of things. One is, Gardner's right, of course, on the timeline of HIV. It took us 3 years then, or 4, depending on how you count it, to have an FDA-approved test to detect HIV in the blood. It took approximately 4 weeks to have a functioning test for COVID, and we're now 4 months in, and we have tests with actually pretty good performance for detection of the virus now. We've migrated, as you know, from nasopharyngeal to saliva as a promising technology. We have antibody tests, a few of them now that are highly accurate. So that's kind of amazing, right? And part of it was the characterization was faster, but it's also that, we went from 4 years to arguably 2 to 3 months on testing. So we're getting smarter and faster. We have a therapy that appears to have some benefit from Gilead called remdesivir. It does fit the pattern that Gardiner has highlighted, which is that most antivirals are weakly active, but it appears to shorten. There's 2 studies now that show it shortens the disease course. The studies are conflicting whether or not it prevents death. I've been one of the people very critical of the company and of the government for designing the trials to not look at the drugs as if to determine if they prevent death, because that to me is the driver of this social isolation we're doing. We have some more studies coming out this week. Some of these immunotherapies will probably work, but we just had a negative study very well by a company that's very well respected in the space, couldn't prevent death from the disease. So we don't know. There's studies going on of convalescent plasma, taking antibodies from some people and giving them to others. If that works, you can imagine a very big change in the therapy area. But one of my biggest concerns is that we have not learned to set up our entire care system as a massive clinical trial engine. And so most people, rather than us learning incrementally about should we give this or that, should we start these 2 together or only one, those kinds of questions, which can only be answered through empiricism, through actually doing experiments, we are missing our chance to ask those questions. And so we are many months into this, and we have a total of a few thousand people enrolled in trials across the entire planet, when we could be in the hundreds of thousands and have highly refined answers to these with no cost to anyone, but except, dedication to the scientific process. Hopefully we will learn on that front.
Well, first of all, thank you for ending on a very hopeful note, Dr. Bach and Gardiner, both of you gentlemen. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for the work you do. And let's hope that the researchers out there come up with either the therapy, the anti-therapy, the viral therapy, or a vaccine. And thanks everybody for listening in today. And I also want to give a shout out to my colleagues Sophie and Zach for organizing this. And we'll see each other for the Corona update next week. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Good afternoon,
Thanks
good morning
so much,
to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.